Hello everyone, welcome to our video today. And today we are diving into the idea that the 18th century mystical interfaith Christian thinker, Emanuel Swedenborg, had deep parallels in his thought to Buddhism, and indeed DT Suzuki, the famous Zen Buddhist teacher in general actually, who brought Buddhism to the West, called Swedenborg the Buddha of the North. And I think as we dive into where that came from and perhaps other parallels between Swedenborg's deep esoteric thinking and Buddhism, we'll find some practical insights for ourselves and might be surprised at the fascinating parallels between mystical Christianity, at least in Swedenborg's vein, and Buddhism, and learning a little bit more about Buddhism in the process. So stay tuned. So I want to open with a quote from David Loy about Swedenborgians and Buddhism, who says, "Buddhists and Swedenborgians may have quite a bit to share and learn from each other." And that is my sentiment as well. This topic is one that I shared on at our denomination's convention, mini course on Swedenborg as the Buddha of the North. And despite that, I'm still kind of a newbie to the idea. I'm still kind of a beginner to Buddhism, but I've spent, a good many months learning more about Buddhism, sitting with different scriptures. Depending on your school of thought, you may not necessarily include some of my favorite readings as scripture, but many different Buddhist writings, and learned a lot about myself and Swedenborgianism through that process, which I think is fascinating. And Suzuki, of course, calling Swedenborg the Buddha of the North, also shared this: "Swedenborg's theological doctrines greatly resemble those of Buddhism." So this isn't just coming from me. This is inspired, I think, by Suzuki's parallels and, my little knowledge when it comes to Buddhism. I've seen them for myself. I've tried to live them. And so I'm going to share those with you as well. Now, I was first introduced to DT Suzuki in seminary. And as I mentioned in our intro, you probably heard of Suzuki because he's considered to be one of the progenitors, if I can say that correctly, of Buddhism in the West. He and others brought Zen Buddhism to the World Parliament of Religions, and also he stayed behind and visited to share more of Buddhism with different thinkers. And funny enough, he's also one of the main progenitors, the main, early sharers of Swedenborgianism, Swedenborgian mystical Christianity, a very kind of interfaith Christianity that believes many people connect with heaven, even from other traditions, that's centered on love, to Japan. Indeed, the texts that you can read in a book called The Buddha of the North are two essays written by DT Suzuki about how Swedenborgianism could be good for Japanese people and people in general, partly because it's deep parallels to Buddhism, and he also liked Swedenborg's, joie de vivre, or his, approach to life. Swedenborg was very much into scientific thinking for most of his life, very much into usefulness as the outward expression of spiritual love. Now, I will note that usefulness, in the way we often think about it, may not exactly be what Swedenborg was writing about, because he believed the greatest use was to uplift love in ourselves and others, which may look a little different than a Western conception of use from time to time. And he thought that Swedenborg could help inspire the Japanese youth and inspire people that were kind of suffering after their loss to Russia in that war. And of course, this is before World War II. And so he brought Swedenborg to Japan. He translated some of Swedenborg's works, including Divine Providence, Divine Love and Wisdom, some of the books that we've covered and are covering in different series here at Spiritual Sunshine. So please tune into those if you're inspired by Suzuki's thinking and are curious at more about what about Swedenborgianism, what about Swedenborg might have inspired him. So Suzuki says this about Swedenborg. Given his character and teachings, Swedenborg ought to be known to the world at large. And it's interesting because despite those parallels and Suzuki's love of Swedenborg, there's no evidence that Swedenborg himself was inspired by Buddhism, at least directly, at all. Swedenborg wrote tons of books. He even had a list of philosophers and thinkers that inspired him. And he doesn't mention, as far as we know, anyone who had deep ties to Buddhism. Now, Swedenborg was highly traveled throughout Europe. He was a Swedish nobleman, thanks to his father, a bishop in the Swedish church, being ennobled. The family was ennobled. Swedenborg was very deeply involved with the politics in Sweden over time. He even helped out the king, I think it was King Charles XI or something like that, with different war machines and things. He kind of reminds me of Merlin in those stories. It's really interesting stuff. He was partnered with another scientist named Polhem, coming up with ways to carry Navy ships across mountain ranges to surprise enemies in bodies of water where they didn't think they'd be, things like that. So pretty awesome stuff. And so he's widely studied. So he probably came across someone that had some idea of Buddhism and might have been inspired by them. Maybe he came across Buddhist texts themselves and just didn't mention it. But there's no evidence as far as we know. So, what are some of these parallels? Well, I'll do my best at highlighting what Suzuki said, which was kind of light in terms of what he described as the parallels. In his essays to the Japanese people, I think he assumed they knew what Buddhism was about and was more just convincing them that Swedenborg was this inspirational thinker. And then he high-level lists a couple things. And so I'll touch on those. And then I'll touch on the things that I've come across in my journey. So not necessarily the most scholarly approach to Buddhism. I came across texts that spoke to me and learned from those schools of thought. And I'll mention some of those. And I'll just highlight what I've encountered and the little bit I've also explored, trying to get some general education in Buddhism. But it's interesting because as we learn more about Buddhism, as the doors open to the Tibetan scriptures, we actually find out that a lot of what we knew in the past was a very small sliver of Buddhism. There are many schools of thought, many approaches to Buddhism, some of which may surprise you. Some of the ideas might surprise you. So I'll touch on some of what surprised me, but again, I am no expert. Now, my learning has largely come from texts like the Dhammapada, which is said to be sayings of the Buddha. So that's supposed to be, directly from the Buddha, so to speak. And then also writings from someone considered to be the second Buddha by the oldest school in Tibet, named Padmasambhava, or Guru Rinpoche. He's considered by that school and a number of others in Tibet and elsewhere to be a second Buddha, and he shared many writings throughout his day, many of which he actually had hidden in caves, according to the texts themselves, for future times when people would be a little bit more accepting of them in different ways. And interestingly enough, he inspired Buddhism in Tibet, according to a lot of the histories. He was the bringer of Buddhism to Tibet, so the originator of Tibetan Buddhism. And also I've been inspired by Dzogchen and Mahamudra in general, different schools of thought within Buddhism, and other writers like Longchenpa from those schools who have very interesting writings, considered to be scripture by many, that you can actually listen to on YouTube with just a good search of Tibetan Buddhist scriptures, or if you can spell it, Padmasambhava. Try to spell it out on Google. I think it'll figure it out for you. It's one word, Padmasambhava, or Guru Rinpoche, and you can listen to these scriptures yourselves, so you don't have to take my word for everything. Now, there are many schools of thought with many different emphases throughout Buddhist ideas and culture, and some of which focus in the West more on certain descriptions of Buddhism, of life, of the 3 poisons or the 5 poisons, virtuousness, and things like that. I won't get into all those details to spare you from them, but I just want to note that, whatever your line of Buddhist connection, I can probably learn from you. So if you want to share some of what you find to be parallels in your line of thinking, I would really appreciate that. Now, I think the reason we're going to summarize some of these similarities is because of the practical element that I think shines when you bring both together. And so let's keep that in mind as we dive in. So why did Suzuki say there were similarities? Well, one area of similarity that Suzuki espoused was between the reason Swedenborg gave for the existence of evil and falsehood with the concept of expedient means in Mahayana Buddhism. Expedient means, or expedient dharmas as it's called, centers on the idea that sometimes the existence of evil and falsity are necessary for the enlightenment of an individual for the greater good. So Suzuki is saying, okay, that's what expedient means in Buddhism, in his line, Buddhism means, or at least in Mahayana. And so Swedenborg has something similar. And yes, Swedenborg believed that evil was necessary for creation, at least the possibility to do evil was. He was a big believer in free will. And he kind of had a physical, spiritual conception of it, that in your spiritual body, you have to be able to turn away from the Lord, to turn away from the spiritual sun that surrounds the Lord, which is the core source of love and wisdom for all things. And in fact, that energy from God is the root of all energy that makes matter. And so Swedenborg believed you have to have freedom to turn and misuse that power in order to have finite beings exist. And Swedenborg believed that God, really loved humans and other beings throughout the universe and wanted them to exist, wanted them to have freedom to love each other and to love itself, love God in healthy ways. And so had to allow for this kind of free will in conception, to have true love be able to take root from seemingly nothing, from the Big Bang or whatever your conception of the universe is. So he believed that was part of the necessity of evil. He also believed that evil was necessary because it taught people to love good. In our finite conception of divinity in our own ways, all our gifts coming from God, we're images and likenesses of divinity, and all our goodness is from God, as many Christians believe, many others believe. So in our finite, embodiment of those gifts, we often have to learn, and evil is a learning tool often. We compare and contrast goodness with evil, destruction and life. And also he believed that evil served to pull other destructive tendencies towards it, so that when you did overcome it, you could overcome, large aspects of it. And you could dismiss or, shed or let go of many different evils at once, because evil had this kind of, tendency to pull to it other evils. And goodness, in the same way, has a tendency to connect with other good things and loving things. And so he lists a number of reasons why evil is necessary. And Suzuki highlights that, oh yes, in Mahayana Buddhism, we say something similar. Suzuki also points to Swedenborg's description of how a Christian gains resurrection in heaven as similar to how a Buddhist obtains rebirth in paradise. Now, this is an interesting idea for many of us, especially Christians who may not, Christians or non-Christians who have heard about Buddhism and how there's no afterlife in Buddhism, or it's just reaching nirvana. In Suzuki's idea of Buddhism, called Pure Land Buddhism, he actually believed that there was an afterlife where perfection reigns, called the Pure Land. Now, he also believed that Pure Land was true even in a world like ours, for the individual who reaches Pure Land, nirvana in their heart and mind. So Pure Land can exist today and will exist in the afterlife. And that's very similar to Swedenborg's idea of heaven. As existing within us today, we're in deep connection with heaven, and we can find a heavenly perspective today where, we see through the transient evils, the transient destructiveness. We've overcome our cravings and attachments, so we're no longer traumatized by things as we were. And so in a way, we reach heaven or a heavenly state today. And so that's very similar, according to Suzuki, to Pure Land Buddhism, and I would agree. Now, it's interesting to note that many Buddhists believe that Pure Land Buddhism isn't quite as perfect or as high as pure nirvana in their mind. And these are other lines of Buddhist thought who believe that you can transcend heaven eventually. So you can either transcend heaven starting now, or transcend it after you've been in the heavenly realms or the Pure Land realms for however many years it takes. And so in that vein, you're reaching kind of a Buddhahood, sort of like Christ, in transcending heaven and becoming one with God. Now, some of us, when we hear that, we may react, with, some type of upsetness hearing us, compared to being like Christ. But of course, Christ himself said we should find unity in Christ, unity in God, in the same way as he did in the Father. So Jesus calls us all to find complete unity, as it's said in the Christian New Testament, in God, and find perfection in God as well, among other things. And so that's Christ's call, and that's often a Buddhist call to find pure, resolution and acceptance of God, to the extent that you even transcend your spiritual body. Now, I say spiritual body very specifically because I think another similarity between Pure Land Buddhism and Swedenborg's idea of heaven is that you do have a body, and it's paradisical realm. Of course, in Swedenborg's idea of it, your environment is shaped by your spirit in the heavenly realm and the spirit of those near you, similar to you. So in the heavenly realm, you're close to people that you're similar to and love, and your heavenly paradise, which spans the gamut in terms of different communities. It's essentially infinite, according to Swedenborg. The way it looks depends on how you all are within. And so you have different kinds of heavenly communities within the fullness of heaven, and you have a body that's perfect in a spiritual way, and you can actually see other people's spiritual bodies because your spiritual eyes are open. Now, Suzuki also highlights this idea of other power, which I think also connects with Christ for many Christians, as a similarity between Swedenborg's ideas and Buddhist ideas. In Suzuki's ideas of Buddhism, you turn to other power for power from a guru, power from a teacher, and ultimately you can turn to other power from the Buddha. And of course, many Christians, not just Swedenborg, at least in the way it's described, say something similar about turning towards Christ. Some Christians, of course, say something similar about turning towards saints as well. And that's the other power received from a divine being such as Jesus, which of course to many Christians, Swedenborg included, is Jehovah in the flesh, is divinity, God, infinite awareness, love and wisdom in the flesh. Of course, many Buddhists would say the same thing about Buddha. And so there's a deep parallel there, and it's kind of fascinating to think about. What's also interesting, though, is if you dive further into it, of course, Christ says, all goodness, all strength comes from God. Many traditions say the same thing. Hinduism describes all power coming from divinity, which is expressed with many different gods, but is actually ultimately one, or even transcends the word one, according to many Hindu priests and priestesses and nuns and scholars. So there's a similarity to many different traditions, to Judaism and many veins of thought, that all of our power, all of our strength is other power in the sense it's from God, but it's not really disconnected, because that's really the true us, because the only true reality is in God. So the only true us is in divinity. The only thing that's going to last in us is everlasting from God. And so we should want God's will to be our own. We should start realizing that that's our true root and self is in divinity. And of course, Christ says many similar things there. And so that kind of takes us to other types of Buddhism that may not focus as much on other power, but talk about the unity of power and strength in awareness, in intrinsic awareness, which I relate to Swedenborg's ideas of divine love and wisdom. Now, Swedenborg had this idea of God as being, infinite goodness, love, and wisdom that gives forth to all creation, that uplifts all love as expressions of itself and of himself, of herself. And so God, being divine awareness, being divine love and wisdom, is the root of all of our consciousness, all of our inner light. And that's very similar to Buddhism, that says that, may not always use the term God, but it says that we all are created from and in infinite awareness, which is intrinsically compassionate, so loving, and knows all, cares about all, is outside of time, or in time, but realizes that time is an illusion. So not really in time. It's interesting. And so it's actually very similar to a mystical idea of Christianity, Swedenborg's mystical idea, and many Christian ideas, if they really get to the root of their theology, if we get to the root of a lot of the scriptures as well. And so I find that fascinating, because a Buddhist may say, well, your ideas of a deity have a lot to be desired in certain ways, but turn to this thing, this divine awareness. And Swedenborg says, well, that thing is God. It's just my word for God. And so there's that fascinating parallel there. And I think it speaks to a lot of people's misconception that Buddhism says there is no God. Indeed, in many different scriptures, including the Dhammapada and Padmasambhava's writings, it mentions continuing to worship your deity, continuing to worship God. Especially Padmasambhava mentions that many times, to continue to worship your deity, but also have mindfulness practice at the root of how you connect with yourself and everyone else as part of you. I think that gets to what some of you may be hoping for out of this talk, which is the practicality of these parallels. So Swedenborg's idea of God as being divine love and wisdom, essentially saying that that's all that mind and consciousness ultimately is awareness, love, and wisdom. And that similarity with Buddhism actually highlights the need to turn to our own sourcedness, our own awareness within, our own intrinsic connectedness to God within. And so, like many Buddhists, I think that highlights spiritual practice, meditative practice, prayerful practice, if you want to call it that, contemplative practice, of many different stripes, but especially, silent practice. So there are many types of meditation uplifted in Buddhism, one of which you meditate on the 31 body parts and that helps you overcome some of your hurtful habits, your mindless habitual tendencies. But the one I think that's most uplifted is just turning to awareness itself, turning to what Swedenborg would call God within, and letting go of your habitual thinking and your identifying with your mind. So both Buddhism and Swedenborg highlight the delusion, the falsity of selfishness, of not just selfishness in terms of I'm being selfish and selfishly prideful and dominating, which is a big thing for Swedenborg and Buddhism to let go of, a big thing encouraged to let go of in both traditions, but also just the idea that you are a self in the way that you've been thinking of yourself, which to both Swedenborg, as he describes it in his exploration of Genesis and other places, and in many lines of Buddhism that I've encountered, that's the root of a lot of hurtfulness, a lot of suffering. So you may have heard in Buddhism, suffering's a big topic, and sometimes it's described as suffering is everything. That's what Buddhists think. Now, I would maybe disagree with that because of how it's actually described in many different communities and many different scriptures. But I would say that's true, that suffering is a key idea that's focused on in order to encourage us to let go of the things that cause us to suffer, that our minds are mainly centered in a suffering world of its own making, because we see things through the delusion of I am this body, or I am this mind and this history. And then since we relate so much to our body and our reputation, our history, our circumstances, that goes even further to this is what I'm worrying about in the future. This is what's going to happen. I'm going to plan this. I'm going to dominate over these other people. So that's very similar between Buddhism and Swedenborgianism, those highlights. Now, those similarities continue, I think, because they both uplift the importance of letting go of that thought and all the hurtfulness that comes from it, and coming to identify as everyone, loving everyone as yourself, as Christ said. Love others as yourself. Love even your enemies, right? And so Swedenborg, of course, believed in that deep interconnectedness of beings, that we all share sourcedness in God, and that everything that works for us, everything that's truly real and is lasting, that we're growing into, is from God. So, the appearance of self, even in heaven, according to Swedenborg, even in that heavenly body we talked about, is an appearance. It's not true reality, because in true reality, there's only one being. It's God, the infinity of divine love and wisdom, of divine awareness, expressed in everything in a very minute, finite way. Buddhism would sometimes say, well, nothing's a real expression of divinity because divinity transcends, all expressions, but they do help guide us to it. And so there's a little bit of difference maybe there, depending on what you're reading, I think. You may hear it explored different ways. In some lines of Buddhist thought, it's actually described that creation and the appearance of things is like looking at the top of a lake or an ocean, and seeing the little twinkles and things. But there's a vast depth below. And a lot of times we take the surface as reality itself, whereas we should, dip our toe into the water. We should get into the water, find our true self there. And then all the things that we see, we experience, we can treat like the ripples they are, as passing and transient. And so that gets us to, why we should overcome suffering, and how we should overcome suffering, I think, in both Buddhism and Swedenborgianism. And that is, when we're centered on transience, our separateness, the deluded sense of self that we come to learn, we don't automatically know, okay, this is us. People talk that way. We are our bodies. We made this mistake, that mistake. We identify with our thinking often. We don't have the meditative practices to take a step back from our minds, which is uplifted both in current day psychotherapy often, and in Buddhist thought, and in Swedenborg's theology, although he didn't always tell us how to practice that, and that meditation is very helpful. And that's what Buddhism highlights, is it's important to practice that and use meditation to embody that so that your mind can find its rightful place. And so, centering on that deludedness means that we often become combative, we become dominating because we identify with very finite, part of the universe. And we're controlled by our thinking. Many of our reactions we have no control over. Our thoughts we follow or we react against. And to find our true selves, we have to take a step back from our minds and realize that our minds are largely, subject to the whims of history, the impact of trauma and ancestry and our experiences and all those things on ourselves. And that's why meditation can help us overcome trauma, PTSD, overcome the limitations of our minds and habits, and why you see so many studies nowadays saying, meditation has a lot of positive benefits. Now, I've highlighted these similarities, but you may have noticed that there's something lacking here, and that's Swedenborg's emphasis on meditation. Swedenborg really doesn't talk about meditation in the same way, encouraging people to do it. Indeed, he doesn't talk a lot about practice at all in his books. He doesn't say, you should go to church every Sunday and you should pray, you should do this or that in a certain way. He actually kind of paints the picture of Christian spirituality and roots it in the text and says, okay, us Christians, we've been getting it wrong, but he doesn't really say how to live it. And I think that's partly because he's talking to a lot of different Christian audiences of his time. He thought he could really help to, heal some of the hurt and destructiveness in the Catholic Church and Protestant churches. He thought he could speak to those things. And then the church, he didn't want to tell every church, okay, you're doing it wrong practically too. He wanted to say, okay, let's get our heart right, our centeredness right on loving others, realizing that even people from other traditions and cultures and religions connect with God, that God's at their root as well. And I've seen a lot of them in heaven too, he would write in his visions. So he wanted to get the root of things right. So he doesn't talk as much about practicality in that way. And it makes sense to his audience, and when we keep in mind his audience. But I will note that Swedenborg himself had a deep meditation practice starting when he was very young. And many of you know this. If you know Swedenborg, if you know his history, he started breathing meditation, breathing exercises, I think before he was 10. Life was a little different back then. He had a lot of lectures and religious things from his dad, who was a bishop in the Swedish church. And he himself started this meditative practice, and it came to the point where his breath was almost unnoticeable, whether or not it had stopped or if he just was in the meditative mindset where, in Buddhist practices, it says you'll stop noticing your breath, you'll stop noticing, your body, quote unquote, your body, because actually those things are delusions. Even in the material realm, they're delusional states because they're not eternal in God, in divine awareness. So in a meditative mode, you won't notice them anymore eventually, if your meditation goes deep enough. And that's a sign of progress, according to Padmasambhava. So it's funny. So we have these accounts of Swedenborg's own meditative practices starting when he was a kid. And he talks about some of the things that Padmasambhava, the so-called second Buddha, says is a sign of meditative progress. Now, of course, Swedenborg spent most of his life deeply involved and insightful in the scientific realm. So he didn't actually, start a church or anything like that. He put out a lot of scientific books and articles, many of which are considered to be quite groundbreaking, quite ahead of his time. Neuronal theory, like the neurons in your brain, he's considered to be the originator of that theory. He talked about how the solar system formed before Kant and Laplace, who are often credited with those ideas. And we know Kant, read Swedenborg, and so on. So he had a lot of really amazing scientific theories. And then, for those who don't know, when he was in his 50s, he discovered his spiritual, connectedness with God, and had a spiritual awakening. And that was during his exploration of the root or the cause of the soul, the place of the soul. And I've heard said, from many Swedenborgian historians, or at least a couple that know this subject really well, that he kind of went through a crisis. And actually, I believe George Dole, who rest in peace, just passed in the last couple weeks, was someone who talked and knew a lot about this idea that Swedenborg had a real crisis of faith, he believes, during this time. And there's some evidence for it in his diaries, according to Reverend Dr. George Dole. And I believe it. And it's interesting because in that kind of crisis, and in his reflection on, okay, where's the soul? He was writing these treatises about it. He probably did a lot of meditation. We know that he kept doing contemplative meditation, where he would meditate on certain subjects. So meditating on where's the soul is kind of like meditating on self, on what am I, where am I, what am I actually, which is a very Buddhist type of core meditative practice. And that ties into meditating on awareness itself, on reality itself, not the verbalized thoughts in your mind, and letting those come and go and start to become more silent. So, those similarities continue even there. And that's when he had his realization. And so that really fits with what someone like Padmasambhava would say is necessary or helpful in finding our awakened state. And that takes us to another parallel, which is the similarities between angels, or celestial humans, and spiritual humans, as Swedenborg calls the different types of angels, spiritual and celestial, and Buddhas, and what some people may call bodhisattvas, or those who center in bodhicitta, which is compassionate awareness and wisdom, and they have a lot of just clear wisdom in life. Things start to go their way, little miracles start happening through them, around them. And Swedenborg, this is also where Swedenborg himself starts to exemplify a Buddha in maybe a way that Suzuki doesn't exactly highlight, but I think Suzuki is aware of some of these similarities. And that has to do with some of the miracles that some people say happened around Swedenborg. We have accounts of different miracles, strange things like, when he would get on this specific boat to travel to other parts of Europe, the captain always knew they'd get there ahead of time because Swedenborg was on. Weird things like that. Now, Swedenborg wasn't big on highlighting them himself. He doesn't write about them. He doesn't say, I did this miracle and that miracle. These are often from other third-party accounts and what have you. And a lot of them center on Swedenborg's awareness of spirits. He would learn things about people from spirits that knew them, things that happened to the spirits in life, or even talk to that person's spirit. And then he'd reveal the answer to their question a couple days later, stuff like that. So a lot of it does involve his visions of heaven and hell, of Pure Land, and the three realms of sorrow, as Buddhists will call hell. They also often call hell in scriptures. So that's kind of an aside real quick, but I was very surprised to read in Buddhist scriptures, at least in the English translations that I've found, hell, you might go to hell before or in your reincarnation process, before you reach nirvana. So there is a conception of hell in Buddhism, which many people believe there is not. Indeed, sometimes, I think in some of Padmasambhava's writings and the Dhammapada as well, I'm surprised at how often it's mentioned, hell, and how serious it's used to be taken, seriously. And sometimes that is, reincarnation itself, having to go back through all these lives is hell, because you're if you're centered in samsara, if you're centered in worldliness, if you identify with the delusion of you are your body and your mind, things are really tough, and that's hell. So there's similarities there. So that aside, Swedenborg had those type of stories around him. And of course, he also had these visions and deep insight and wisdom that he started writing about and sharing, initially anonymously, but he was eventually outed. And that's very similar to a Buddha, of course, having that deep insight, even visions of the Pure Land and other realms. The Buddhas are said to have had those visions. And I say the Buddhas not just because of the Buddha as we know him and Padmasambhava, but also because many Buddhist texts say there have been many Buddhas and that we all have the Buddha spirit within. And so that's very similar again to Swedenborg's idea of having that deep connection with God and that angelic spirit within. Of course, he says all that makes an angel is from God. So the angelicness of the angels in heaven are just embodiments of God's qualities in more seemingly finite ways. You know, we each have our own expression of angelicness according to Swedenborg. And that kind of ties into the idea that we become angels when we come into heaven. And so that's a little bit of a difference between how a lot of folks, me included before I became Swedenborgian in my 20s, and what Swedenborg thought about heaven. The difference between those two conceptions is often that angels are made as angels and humans are still just spirits in heaven, whereas Swedenborg believed angels are human spirits and alien spirits or whatever spirits that have lived in the earthly realms in heaven. We become angels, we become angelic. There is no created being that just automatically was an angel. That's fascinating as well, because besides pure awareness and divine awareness itself in Buddhism, all created beings have to go through kind of unprocess. We're born and we have to let go of the delusions we might be born with. Now, some beings aren't born quite in a delusion state, according to Buddhist thinking. And some beings are born more into a deluded state, partly due to the karma through reincarnation. But each of us kind of goes through that process before we reach Pure Land and before we reach Nirvana. And of course, when we reach Nirvana, we realize that the part of us that's reaching Nirvana never left Nirvana. We always had divine awareness at our core. That's why I say unprocessed. It's actually realizing, I already have it. I can stop worrying. I can let go of my deluded mindsets. It's already here. There's nowhere to go. And that's a big topic in Buddhism that I do see, mirrored in Swedenborgianism. He just doesn't highlight it the same way. It says, all our core, our spirit, all our gifts, all the good things that are happening for us, even in our body, are expressions of divinity. Now we need to just settle into that intrinsic love, that intrinsic wisdom within. Remember and know that it's there. And we can let go. Oops, lost my mic for a second. We can let go of all our deludedness around it and instead of it, which is the reason for our deep feelings of estrangement, our depressions, our fears and misgivings, our anxieties, all those things that are called sorrowful or are tragic and hurtful in our lives. So I could probably keep going with these parallels, because as you can see, I almost feel like every major idea in Swedenborgianism is paralleled in these veins of Buddhist thinking. Now, there are many other veins of Buddhist thinking, as I mentioned, and some of which focus on things that I won't mention. And so if you think I'm missing a core idea around Buddhism, please mention that in the comments, and we can connect about it, because I'd love to learn and talk more about it. I know a lot of Buddhist lines of thought highlight the three poisons and other poisons, perhaps, that come from the deluded mindset, selfishness and all those things. Again, I think there are deep parallels with what Swedenborg says we should start to become aware of in ourselves as hurtful, as deluded, and let go of. And he believed that the Christian scriptures, through symbolism and sometimes directly, tell us to let go of those things as well. So his line of Christianity very much fits with a lot of lines of Buddhism as saying, okay, to find heavenliness, it's not just, okay, I'm Christian, you write it on your forehead or something, or you wear your badge or you go to church. It's actually adopting Christ's love. Same with Judaism and Islam and Hinduism. He believed to find the core of health in your tradition, you need to really center on the love that's there, the compassion and wisdom that's there. It's not always very clear depending on the text. You can read some chapters of the Bible and run into some genocide and things like that in the literal sense. And we talk about how to approach those texts in some of our talks here at Spiritual Sunshine, which in brief, it's remembering the issues there because they highlight our tendencies to be genocidal from a religious state. But it also highlights spiritual truths, and that's that we should release or let go of all the hurtful, destructive things in us. They often call the societies that they're going to wipe out destructive and sacrificing humans and lustful and all these things. And so they should be wiped out. God says their idolatrous practice is going to really ruin your practices. So get rid of them. So in a symbolic sense, we should let go of those things in ourselves. All that craving and lust, that's in the Bible itself, as well as in Swedenborg's ideas and in Buddhism, that all our cravings and lusts and even aversions, which are another type of craving, so to speak. You crave situations where that doesn't happen, or you are fearful of situations because of what you crave, what you're attached to. That's all delusioned and leads to your suffering. And so let go of that. Find that your will is God's will. So whatever comes, you accept as your will because that's God's will. You accept the impact of evil on the world, even on you, and you start to see that you are one with others. So loving others as yourself becomes quite the literal understanding of Jesus's words. Love others as yourself because they are yourself, right? So there's those deep connections in the traditions. I hope you learn something from this talk. Again, I couldn't have been more surprised at hell in Buddhist scriptures. The Buddha is telling us to continue to worship our deity, et cetera, et cetera. So we have some misconceptions in the West and some things that we've just dismissed from Buddhism through our ignorance. I think there's a lot to learn. It highlights healthy spiritual practice. And so I think I'll end with that we should all be taking time out of our days to meditate, to do the things that psychotherapy, even if you don't believe in God, you don't believe in this or that, these scientific studies tell us is so important. It's the one thing we all know. We all know we know. It's that we ourselves are aware. We don't necessarily know, each other are aware. Or other people have a sense of awareness. It could be a dream or something. People have all kinds of arguments. We could always disagree about what's going on. But one thing I'm sure that you know is that you are aware and that you shine light onto your mind. You're not your mind. You experience your mind. You have very little control over it often. You can sometimes set it on different tracks, although often you can't even do that. So meditation helps us to get to know our true selves, know what we do know, get to know yourself a little bit, right? And to take a step back from all that we are delusioned and falsely identifying with and find reality as it comes and that divine awareness, I believe, that divine love and wisdom at our root. So thank you for joining with me in this exploration of the parallels between Buddhism and Swedenborgianism, why DT Suzuki called Swedenborg the Buddha of the North. Really appreciate you connecting and sharing. And follow us for more videos of different stripes. And most of all, go forth knowing that you are loved and are loved. Bye.